Archetypes are a concept introduced by Carl Gustav Jung in his works, and are an integral part of Jungian psychology. Jung describes archetypes as typical attitudes, ways of behaving, and ideal forms and drives that must constitute the typically instinctive behavior of humanity. Ideas constantly present in the human mind throughout history. These ideas can be manifested in multiple ways, especially in art's many forms. In this series, we take a look at how these archetypes are represented in video games. Welcome to the Game Archetype Library. Orcs are a humanoid race that frequently makes appearances in fantasy settings. Often described as brutish and warmongering, the archetype has evolved over the years from an unidimensional race of evil monsters to a more nuanced race that, much like humans, is capable of both good and evil. The term orc first appeared in this form in the 16th century as a denotation of ogre, possibly hailing from the obsolete usage of orc to describe a sea monster, the Italian word for monster, orco, the Latin word orcus, meaning underworld, or the Old English word orcneus, mentioned once in Beowulf to describe a tribe of corrupted descendants of Cain that were condemned by God. Orcneus is believed to originate from a combination of the Latin word orcus, glossed at the time as goblin, spectre, or hell devil, and neas, corpses, making it something along the line of demon corpses or underworld corpses. That sounds like a hard band name, not gonna lie. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien used orc as a term to denominate humanoid creatures of evil. While for the most part the orcs in his works are no different from goblins, the Uruk breeds are more alike to what is today associated with the archetype, with the brutish, strong, pig-faced humanoid figures with tusks and an underbite. Later, Dungeons & Dragons included orcs as a hostile race, and its descriptions and illustrations of the creatures inspired many of the creators that would come after, further shaping the definition of orcs into what they are imagined today. The etymological idea of the hellspawn and the portrayal of orcs in the Lord of Rings made the association of orcs as forces of evil a very common characteristic of the archetype, often being associated with dark magic and demons themselves. While this was the favored representation of orcs for quite some time, in the 90s and the 2000s especially, the process of deconstruction of some concepts in fiction was intensified, questioning some of the old norms established. Two of the most popular deconstructions were the rise of the anti-hero in opposition to the dominance of the idealistic figure of the hero, and the deconstruction of the monster, favoring monsters as possible misunderstood creatures over the simplistic evil-by-nature portrayals. The perception of orcs was affected by the changes of the portrayal of monsters in media, and the rise of the unconventional heroes, with orcs becoming often portrayed as more nuanced creatures akin to humans instead of mindlessly evil monsters, and even as possible protagonists in fantasy settings. Regardless of how they are represented, not rarely they are depicted as creatures that were previously tainted or corrupted by some outside evil, often sticking to the classic description of them being elves before their fall. But it has become more common to display them fighting off the influences of evil on a path of redemption to their lost honor. A common trait that comes from this taint is the widely represented greenskin. Green is a color that has become associated with monsters, possibly due to the depictions of European dragons as mostly green monsters, which reflected their nature as reptile-like creatures, and the later theatrical representations of Frankenstein in the 19th century, that, while they contradicted the book's description of a yellow skin in favor of the usage of blue and green, ended up popularizing the portrayal of Shelley's monster as green-skinned, and as a consequence, further established the connection between the color green and monsters. Much like Frankenstein wasn't originally supposed to be green, even though most depictions of orcs originate in Tolkien's works, in which they were dark-skinned instead. Eventually, depictions of orcs begin to favor the characteristic of green skin color for the most part, to the point where while there is still variance in the representations of their skin colors, with some even choosing blue as their skin color, the green skin has become probably one of the most recognizable traits of orcs. Orcs are often depicted as creatures living in primitive societies with a fair share of similarities to some characteristics of human societies. These societies operate in a tribal collaboration format, mostly self-sufficient, with each member having to play their own roles and are ruled by a simple yet strict code of honor that must be respected. While in general, orc societies are mostly portrayed as brutal, warmongering, with primitive technology and favoring strength as their most valued virtue, they shouldn't be mistaken for mere stupid brutes. In fact, often they can employ tactics and tools that would be unexpected for those who underestimate their capabilities. This reflects the shift over the years in the perception of the tribes that the Romans referred to as barbarians, especially the Germanic peoples, that served as the basis for many of the traits of orcish culture. While those tribes were maybe not as developed as the Roman Empire in some aspects, they were far from being as bad as the Romans painted them to be. In fact, the Romans greatly exaggerated some aspects of their neighbors to attempt to demonize the different cultures surrounding them and to try to downplay the capabilities of their enemies in an arrogant manner that led to their eventual downfall. With this shift in the perception of the real-world cultures that are often the basis of the fictional culture of orcs, and with the rising popularity of the deconstruction of the figure of the monster, orcs have been depicted not being so unidimensional as to solving everything with brute force, but also being competent at magic, marksmanship, subterfuge, military tactics and intelligence, and craftsmanship. Even if it's not always on par with the level attained by other races in these competences, they can always be competitive enough to at least hold their own when paired against others. The orc archetype has come a long way over the years. From the simple, hive-mind-like, thoughtless, aggressive evil monster, to the more complex, human-like creature with individual character. These developments of the portrayal of the fictional race are a result of the nature of good and evil becoming more nuanced in media, and the overall growing tendency of treating different cultures as neutral instead of demonizing them. Unlike the Tolkien orcs that were overall evil to contrast with the benevolent nature of elves, the contemporary portrayal of orcs for the most part establishes them as beings that live in different cultures that aren't inherently evil, but just different from the ones of other races. While the evil for the sake of evil orc reflects the ideas of evil and relates to the possible cruelty of man, the good monster orcs reflect the belief that one isn't defined by their place of origin and that looks can be deceiving. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.